Letter. Maybe you've heard of it. One of my favorites, I guess you could say, from school. And as usual, we will start with setting our intention and then clearing our space, and then, of course, getting started on this new book, which I think you will enjoy. We will, of course, start at the very beginning and go through the editor's note and the introduction to the Scarlet Letter. Alright, so without further ado, let's go ahead and just get right into it. Alright, so I've already got the candles lit. So let's go ahead and set our intention. I set the intention that tonight's reading accomplish the greatest and highest good for all. Alright, now we'll send it into the flame and let the flame do its thing to make it so. Okay, now let's go ahead and move our book out of the way so we can do our cleanse. Right there. So inside of the hardcover is a graduate, kind of like a certificate that was presented to someone by the name of Muriel Sanders on March 9th, 1918. So this is an antique, as you can tell. Right, the People's Library, the Scarlet Letter, Nathaniel Hawthorne. Now, look at that. We have the editor's note, so we'll go ahead and start with that. I do not want to be a doctor and live by men's diseases, nor a minister to live by their sins, nor a lawyer and live by their quarrels. So I don't see that there is anything left for me but to be an author. So wrote Nathaniel Hawthorne to his mother at the time he was preparing to enter college. From his childhood, he had a taste for writing, and when at college, he developed it by making translations from the classics. His first public work appeared in The Token, an annual edited by Peter Barley, but it met with appreciation in England only, several of his contributions being republished in the Athenaeum. Hawthorne found that the literature did not pay, and he accepted a post of waiter in the Boston Custom House. A change of government occurred 2 years later, and he was superseded by one of the successful party's nominees. It was not until he was 46 years of age in 1850, after another period of customs work in his native town, that he made his life's success with the Scarlet Letter. This work definitely proved his possession of literary genius and secured him fame amongst the world's great writers. If, as he himself and it lacks sunshine, it is without doubt an extraordinary presentation of the life of the Puritan settlers of New England, among whom the author's forebears were not the least distinguished. Nathaniel Hawthorne, the son of a seaman, was born in the United States of America in 1804 and died in 1864. Now, this story is set, though, in the Puritan days, so it's kind of like a little bit of a rewind backwards, like a prequel to the book we just read. That was 1750s America. This is like 1650s, 1610s, whatever, 1620s America. So this is like when they first got here. Okay, so we're actually going back to the beginning of that. Okay, so now, this was published by Castle and Company, London, New York, Toronto, and Melbourne, and has Roman numerals for the publication year. So that's actually 1910 that this book was published. So we do have some contents, table of contents with our chapters, and we are going to start with the introductory, which is called the Custom House. The Custom House, introductory to the Scarlet Letter. It is a little remarkable that, though disinclined to talk over much of myself and my affairs at the fireside, and to my personal friends, an autobiographical impulse should twice in my life have taken possession of me in addressing the public. The first time was 3 or 4 years since, when I favored the reader inexcusably, and for no earthly reason that either the indulgent reader or the intrusive author could imagine, with a description of my way of life in the deep quietude of an old man's, or like an house for a minister. And now, because beyond my deserts I was happy enough to find a listener or two on the former occasion, I again seized the public by the button and talk of my 3 years' experience in a custom house. The example of the famous P.P., clerk of the parish, was never more faithfully followed. The truth seems to be, however, that when he casts his gleams forth upon the wind, the author addresses not the many who will fling aside his volume or never take it up, but the few who will understand him better than most of his schoolmates circle of existence by bringing him to the communion with it. It is scarcely decorous, however, to speak all, even where we speak impersonally, but as thoughts are frozen in utterance benumbed, unless the speaker stand in some true relation with his audience. It may be pardonable to imagine that a friend, a kind and apprehensive, though not the closest friend, is listening to our talk, and then a native reserve being thawed by his genial consciousness, we may prate of the circumstances that lie around us, and even of oneself, but still keep the inmost me behind its veil. To this extent, and within these limits, an author, methinks, may be autobiographical without violating either the reader's rights or his own. It will be seen likewise that this custom house sketch has a certain propriety of a kind always recognized in literature as explaining how a large portion of the following pages came into my possession, and as offering proofs of the authenticity of a narrative therein contained. This, in fact, a desire to put myself in my true position as editor, or very little more of the most prolix among the tales that make up my volume. This and no other is my true reason for assuming a personal relation with the public, and accomplishing the main purpose it has appeared allowable, by a few extra touches, to give a faint representation of a mode of life not therefore described, together with some of the characters that move in it, among whom the author happened to make one. In my native town of Salem, at the head of what, half a century ago in the days of old King Derby, was a bustling wharf, but which is now burdened with decayed wooden warehouses, and exhibits few or no symptoms of commercial life, except perhaps a bark or brig halfway down its melancholy length, discharging hides, or nearer at hand a Nova Scotia schooner pitching out her cargo of firewood at the head, I say, of this dilapidated wharf, which the tide often overflows, and along which, at the base and in the rear of the row of buildings, the track of many languid years is seen in a border of unthrifty grass. Here, with a view from its front windows down this not very enlivening prospect, and thence across the harbor, stands a spacious edifice of brick from the loftiest point of its roof. During precisely 3.5 hours of each forenoon, floats or droops in breeze or calm the banner of the Republic, but with the 13 stripes turned vertically instead of horizontally, and thus indicating that a civil and not a military post of Uncle Sam's government is here established. Its front is ornamented with a portico or half a dozen wooden pillars, supporting a balcony, beneath which a flight of wide granite steps descends towards the street. Over the entrance hovers an enormous specimen of the American eagle with outspread wings, a shield before her breast, and, if I recollect all right, a bunch of intermingled thunderbolts and barbed arrows in each claw. With the customary infirmity of temper that characterizes this unhappy fowl, she appears by the fierceness of her beak and eye, and the general truculency of her attitude, to threaten mischief to the inoffensive community, and especially to warn all citizens careful of their safety against intruding on the premises which she overshadows with her wings. Nevertheless, vixenly as she looks, many people are seeking at this very moment to shelter themselves under the wing of the federal eagle, imagining, I presume, that her bosom has all the softness and snugness of an elder down pillow, but she has no great tenderness even in her best of moods, and sooner or later, often sooner than late, is apt to fling off her nestlings with a scratch of her claw, a dab of her beak, or a rankling wound from her barbed arrows. The pavement round about the above described edifice, which we may as well custom house of the port has grass enough growing in its chinks to show that it has not of late days been worn by any multitudinous resort of business. In some months of the year, however, there often chances a forenoon when affairs move onward with a livelier tread. Such occasions might remind the elderly citizen of that period before the last war with England, when Salem was a port by itself, and not scorned as she is now by her own merchants and ship owners who permit her wharves to crumble to ruin while their ventures go to swell. Needlessly and imperceptibly, the mighty flood of commerce at New York or Boston. On some such morning, when 3 or 4 vessels happen to have arrived at once, usually from Africa or South America, or be on the verge of their departure thitherward, there is a sound of frequent feet passing briskly up and down the granite steps. Here, before his own wife had greeted him, you may greet the sea-flush shipmaster just in port with his vessel's papers under his arm in a tarnished tin box. Here too comes his owner, cheerful or somber, gracious or in the sulks, accordingly as his scheme of the now accomplished voyage has been realized in merchandise that will readily be turned to gold, or has buried him under a bulk of incommodities such as nobody will care to rid him of. Here likewise the charm of the wrinkle-browed, grizzly-bearded, careworn merchant. We have the smart young clerk who gets the taste of traffic as a wolf cub does of blood, and already sends adventures in his master ships when he had better be sailing mimic boats upon a mill pond. Another figure in the scene is the outward-bound sailor, in quest of a protection, or the recently arrived one, pale and feeble, seeking a passport to the hospital. Nor must we forget the captains of the rusty little schooners that bring firewood from the British provinces. A rough-looking set of tarpaulins, without the alertness of the Yankee aspect, but contributing an item of no slight importance to our decaying trade. Cluster all these individuals together, as they sometimes were, with other miscellaneous ones, to diversify the group, and for the time being it made the custom house a stirring scene. More frequently, however, on ascending the steps, you would discern in the entry, if it were summertime, or in their appropriate rooms, if wintry or inclement weather, a row of venerable figures sitting in old-fashioned chairs, which were tipped on their hind legs back against the wall. Oftentimes they were asleep, but occasionally might be heard talking together in voices between speech and a snore, and with that lack of energy that distinguishes the occupants of almshouses and all other human beings who depend for subsistence on charity or monopolized labor or anything else but their own independent exertions. These old gentlemen seated like Matthew at the receipt of customs, but not very liable to be summoned thence, like him, for apostolic errands, were custom house officers. Furthermore, on the left hand, as you enter the front door, is a certain room or office about 15 feet square and a lofty height, with 2 of its arched windows commanding a view of the aforesaid dilapidated wharf, and the third looking across a narrow lane and along a portion of Derby Street. All 3 give glimpses of the shops of grocers, blockmakers, stop sellers, and ship chandlers, around the doors of which are generally to be seen, laughing and gossiping, clusters of old salts and such other wharf rats as taunt the whopping of a seaport. The room itself is cobwebbed and dingy with old paint. floor is strewed with gray and in a fashion that has elsewhere fallen into long disuse, and it is easy to conclude from the general slovenliness of the place that this is a sanctuary into which womankind with their tools of magic, the broom and mop, has very infrequent access. In the way of furniture, there is a stove with a voluminous funnel, an old pine desk with a three-legged stool beside it, two or three wood-bottomed chairs, exceedingly decrepit and infirm, and yet not to forget the library. On some shelves, a score or two of volumes of the Acts of Congress and a bulky digest of the revenue laws. A tin pipe ascends through the ceiling and forms a medium of vocal communication with other parts of the edifice. And here, some 6 months ago, pacing from corner to corner or lounging on the long-legged stool with his elbow on the desk and his eyes wandering up and down the columns of the morning newspaper, you might have recognized, honored reader, the same individual who welcomed you into his cheery little study where the sunshine glimmered so pleasantly through the willow branches on the western side of the old manse. But now, should you go thither to seek him, you would inquire in vain, for the locofoco surveyor, the besom of reform, has swept him out of the office, and a worthier successor wears his dignity and pockets his emoluments. This old town of Salem, my native place, though I have dwelt much away from it both in boyhood and maturer years, possesses or did possess a hold on my affections, the force of which I have never realized during my seasons of actual residence here. Indeed, so far as its physical aspect is concerned, with its flat, unvaried surface, covered chiefly with wooden houses, few or none of which pretend to architectural beauty, its irregularity, which is neither picturesque nor quaint, but only tame, its long and lazy street, lounging wearisomely through the whole extent of the peninsula, with Gallows Hill and New Guinea at one end and a view of the almshouse at the other. Such being the features of my native town, it would be quite as reasonable to form a sentimental attachment to a disarranged checkerboard, and yet, though invariably happiest elsewhere, this is within me a feeling for Old Salem which, in lack of a better phrase, I must be content to call its affection. The sentiment is probably assignable deep and aged roots, which my family had struck in the soil. It is now nearly 2 centuries and a quarter since the original Britain. The earliest emigrant of my name made his appearance in the wild and forest-bordered settlement which has since become a city. And here his descendants have been born and died, and have mingled their earthy substance with the soil until no small portion of it must necessarily be akin to the mortal frame wherewith. For a little while I walk the streets. In part, therefore, the attachment which I speak of is the mere sensuous sympathy of dust for dust. Few of my countrymen can know what it is, nor as frequent transplantation is perhaps better for the stock need they consider it desirable to know. But the sentiment has likewise its moral quality. The figure of that first ancestor, invested by a family tradition with a dim and dusky grandeur, was present to my boyish imagination as far back as I can remember. unworn street with such a stately port, and made so large a figure as a man of war and peace, a stronger claim than for myself, whose name is seldom heard in my face. Hardly known. He was a soldier, legislator, judge. He was a ruler in the church. He had all the Puritanic traits, both good and evil. He was likewise a bitter persecutor, as witnessed the Quakers, who have remembered him in their histories and relate an incident of his hard severity towards a woman of their sect, which will last longer. It is to be feared than any record of his better deeds, although these were many. His son, too, inherited the persecuting spirit and made himself so conspicuous in the martyrdom of the witches that their blood may fairly be said to have left a stain upon him. So deep a stain indeed that his old dry bones in the Charter Street burial ground must still retain it, if they have not crumbled utterly to dust. I know not whether these ancestors of mine bethought themselves to repent and ask pardon of heaven for their cruelties, or whether they are now groaning under the heavy consequences of them in another state of being. At all events, I, the present writer, as their representative, hereby take shame upon myself for their sakes, and pray that any curse incurred by them, as I have heard, and as the dreary and unprosperous condition of the race for so many a long year back would argue to exist, may be now and henceforth removed. Doubtless, however, either of these stern and black-browed Puritans would have thought it quite a sufficient retribution for his sins, that after so long a lapse of years the old trunk of the family tree, with so much venerable moss upon it, should have borne as its topmost bough, as an idler like myself, no aim that I have ever cherished, would they recognize as laudable, no success of mine, if my life beyond its domestic cope had ever been brightened by success, would they deem otherwise than worthless, if not positively disgraceful. What is he? Murmurs the one grey shadow of my forefathers to the other. A writer of storybooks, what kind of a business in life, what mode of glorifying God, or being serviceable to mankind in his day and generation may that be? Why, the degenerate fellow might as well have been a fiddler. Such are the compliments bandied between my great grandsires and myself across the gulf of time. And yet, let them scorn me as they will, strong traits of their nature have intertwined themselves with mine. Planted deep in the town's earliest infancy and childhood by these two earnest and energetic men, the race has ever since subsisted here, and always do in respectability, never, so far as I have known, disgraced by a single unworthy member, but seldom or never, on the other hand, after the first two generations, performing any memorable deed, or so much as putting forward a claim to public notice. Gradually they have sunk almost out of sight, as old houses here and there about the streets get covered halfway to the eaves by the accumulation of new soil. From father to son, for above 100 years they followed the sea, a grey-headed shipmaster in each generation, retiring from the quarter dock to the homestead, while a boy of 14 took the hereditary place before the mast, confronting the salt, the spray, and the gale which had blustered against his sire and grandsire. The boy also in due time passed from the forecastle to the cabin, spent a tempestuous manhood, and returned from his world wanderings to grow old and die, and mingle his dust with one natal earth. This long connection of a family with one spot as its place of birth and burial creates a kindred between the human being and the locality, quite independent of any charm in the scenery or moral circumstances that surround him. his father or grandfather came, as little claim to be called a. Whose third century is creeping clings to the spot where his successive generations have been embedded. It is no matter that the place is joyless for him, that he is weary of the old wooden houses, the mud and dust, the dead level of sight and sentiment, the chill east wind, and the chillest of social atmospheres. All these and whatever faults besides he may see or imagine are nothing to the purpose. The spell survives, and just as powerfully as if the needle spot were an earthly paradise. So has it been in my case. I felt it almost as destiny to make Salem my home, so that the mold of features and cast of character which had long been familiar here, ever as one representative of the race lay down in his grave, another assuming as if it were his sentry march along the main street might still in my little day be seen and recognized in this old town. Nevertheless, this very sentiment is an evidence that the connection which has become an unhealthy one should at least be severed. Human nature will not flourish any more than a potato if it be planted and replanted for too long, for a series of generations in the same worn-out soil. My children have had other birthplaces, and so far as their fortunes may be within my control, shall strike their roots into the unaccustomed earth. He has no conception of the oyster-like tenacity with which an old settler over whom his third century is creeping clings to the spot where his successive generations have been embedded. It is no matter that the place is joyless for him, that he is weary of the old wooden houses, the mud and dust, the dead level of sight and sentiment, the chill east wind, and the chillest of social atmospheres. All these and whatever faults besides he may see or imagine are nothing to the purpose. All these and whatever faults besides he may see or imagine are nothing to the purpose. The spell survives, and just as powerfully as if the natal spot were an earthly paradise. So it has been in my case. I felt it almost as a destiny to make Salem my home, so that the mold of features and cast of character which had all along been familiar here, ever as one representative of the race lay down in his grave, another assuming, as it were, his sentry march along the main street, might still in my little day be seen and recognized in the old town. Nevertheless, this very sentiment is an evidence that the connection which has become an unhealthy one should at least be severed. Human nature will not flourish any more than a potato if it be planted and replanted for too long, a series of generations in the same worn-out soil. My children have had other birthplaces, and so far as their fortunes may be within my control, shall strike their roots into unaccustomed earth. On emerging from the old manse, it was chiefly this strange, indolent, unjoyous attachment for my native town that brought me to fill a place in Uncle Sam's brick edifice, when I might as well or better have gone somewhere else. My doom was on me. It was not the first time nor the second that I had gone away, as it seemed permanently, but yet returned like the bad halfpenny, or as if Salem were for me the inevitable center of the universe. So one fine morning I the oldest inhabitant was at once settled when I looked at them. For upwards of 20 years before this epoch, the independent position of the collector had kept the Salem Custom House out of the whirlpool of political vicissitude which makes the tenure of office generally so fragile. A soldier, New England's most distinguished soldier, he stood firmly on the pedestal of his gallant services and himself secure in the wise liberality of the successive administrations through which he had held office. He had been the safety of his subordinates in many an hour of danger and earthquake. General Miller was radically conservative, a man over whose kind nature or habit had no slight influence, attaching himself strongly to familiar faces and with difficulty moved to change even when change might have brought unquestionable improvement. Thus, on taking charge of my department, I found few but aged men. They were ancient sea captains for the most part, who, after being tossed on every sea and standing up sturdily against life's tempestuous blast, had finally drifted into this quiet nook with little to disturb them except the periodical terrors of a presidential election. They one and all acquired a new lease of existence, though by no means less liable than their fellow men to age and infirmity. They had evidently some talisman or other that kept death at bay. 2 or 3 of their number, as I was assured, being gouty and rheumatic, or perhaps bedridden, never dreamed of making their appearance at the Custom House during a large part of the year. But after a torpid water would creep out into the warm sunshine of May or June, go lazily about what they termed duty, and at their own leisure and convenience betake themselves to bed again. I must plead guilty to the charges of abbreviating the official breadth of more than one of these venerable servants of the Republic. They were allowed on my representation to rest from their arduous labors, and soon afterwards, as if their sole principle of life had been zeal for their country's service, as I verily believe it was, withdrew to a better world. It is a pious consolation to me that, through my interference, a sufficient space was allowed them for repentance of the evil and corrupt practices into which, as a matter of course, every Custom House officer must be supposed to fall. Neither the front nor the back entrance of the Custom House opens on the road to paradise. The greater part of my officers were Whigs. It was well for their venerable brotherhood that the new surveyor was not a politician, and though a faithful Democrat in principle, neither received nor held his office with any reference to political services. Had it been otherwise, had an active politician been put into the influential post to assume the easy task of making it against a Whig collector, whose infirmities withheld him from the personal administration of his office, hardly a man of the old corps would have drawn the breath of official life within a month after the exterminating angel had come upon the Custom House steps. According to the received code, in such manners, it would have been nothing short of duty in a politician to bring every one of those white heads under the axe of the guillotine. It was plain enough to discern that the old fellows dreaded some such discourtesy at my hands. It pained and at the same time amused me to behold the terrors that attended my advent, to see a furrowed cheek, weather-beaten by half a century of storm, turn ashy pale at the glance of so harmless an individual as myself, to detect as one or another addressed me the tremor of a voice which in long past days had been wont to bellow through a speaking trumpet hoarsely enough to frighten Boreas himself to silence. They knew, these excellent old persons, that by all established rule, and as regarded some of them weighed by their own lack of efficiency for business, they ought to have given place to younger men, or mirrors tilted back against the wall, awaking, however, once or twice in a forenoon to bore one another with the several thousandth repetition of old sea stories and multi-jokes that had grown to be passwords and countersigns among them. The discovery was soon made, I imagine, that the new surveyor had no great harm in him, so with lightsome hearts and the happy consciousness of being usefully employed in their own behalf at least, if not for our beloved country, these good old gentlemen went through the various formalities of office. Sagaciously under their spectacles did they peep into the holds of vessels. Mighty was their fuss about little matters, and marvelous sometimes the obtuseness that allowed greater ones to slip between their fingers. Whenever such a mischance occurred, a wagon load of valuable merchandise that had been smuggled ashore at noonday, perhaps indirectly beneath the unsuspicious noses. Nothing could exceed the vigilance and alacrity. With which they proceeded to lock. So, alacrity is like eagerly ready, cheerfully ready. And double lock and secure with tape and sealing wax all the avenues of the delinquent vessel. Instead of a reprimand for their previous negligence, the case seemed rather to require an eulogium on their praiseworthy caution after the mischief had happened, a grateful recognition of the promptitude of their zeal, and the moment that there was no longer any remedy. Unless people are more than commonly disagreeable, it is my foolish habit to contract a kindness for them. The better part of my companion's character, if it have a better part, is that which usually comes uppermost in my regard and forms the type whereby I recognize, as most of these old custom house officers had, good traits, and as my position in reference to them, being paternal and protective, was favorable to the growth of friendly sentiments. I soon grew to like them all. It was pleasant in the summer forenoons, when the fervent heat that almost liquefied the rest of the human family merely communicated a genial warmth to their half-torpid systems. It was pleasant to hear them chatting in the back entry, a row of them all tipped against the wall as usual, while the frozen witticisms of past generations were thought out and came bubbling with laughter from their lips. Externally, the jollity of aged men has much in common with the mirth of children. The intellects any more than a deep sense of humor has little to do with the matter. It is with both a gleam that plays upon the surface and imparts a sunny and cheery aspect alike to the green branch and gray mouldering trunk. In one case, however, it is real sunshine. In the other, it more resembles the phosphorescent glow of decay. It would be sad injustice, the reader must understand, to represent all my excellent old friends as in their dotage. Okay, so the dotage means like a period in their life as they are aging, like Tamanin in the last story. In the first place, my coadjutors were not invariably old. Coadjutors is like a bishop in training for the diocese, in the Catholic Church. There were men among them in their strength and prime, of marked ability and energy, and altogether superior to the sluggish and dependent mode of life on which their evil stars had cast them. Then, moreover, the white locks of age were sometimes found to be the thatch of an intellectual tenement in good repair. But as respects the majority of my corps veterans, there will be no wrong done. If I characterize them generally as a set of wearisome old souls who had gathered nothing worth preservation from their varied experience of life, they seemed to have flung away all the golden grain of practical wisdom which they had enjoyed so many opportunities of harvesting, and most carefully to have stored their memories with the husks. They spoke with far more interest and unction of their morning's breakfast, or yesterday's, today's, or tomorrow's dinner, than of the shipwreck of 40 or 50 years ago, and all the world's wonders which they had witnessed with their youthful eyes. The father of the custom house, the patriarch not only of this little squad of officials, but I am bold to say of the respectable body of tide waters all over the United States, was a certain permanent inspector. He might truly be termed a legitimate son of the revenue system, dyed in the wool, or rather born in the purple, since his sire, a revolutionary colonel and formerly collector of the port, had created an office for him and appointed him to fill it at a period of the early ages which few living men can now remember. This inspector, when I first knew him, was a man of 80 years or thereabouts, and certainly one of the most wonderful specimens of wintergreen that you would be likely to discover. In a lifetime's search. With his final florid cheeks, his compact fingers smartly arrayed in a bright buttoned blue coat, the brisk and vigorous step, and his hale and hearty aspect altogether, he seemed not young indeed, but a kind of new contrivance of Mother Nature in the shape of man whom age and infirmity had no business to touch. His voice and laugh, which perpetually re-echoed through the custom house, had nothing of the tremulous quaver and crackle of an old man's utterance. They came strutting out of his lungs like the crow of a cock or the blast of a clarion. Looking at him merely as an animal, and there was very little else to look at, he was a most satisfactory object from the thorough healthfulness and wholesomeness of his system, and his capacity at that extreme age to enjoy all, or nearly all, the delights which he had ever aimed at or conceived of. The careless security of his life in the custom house on a regular income, and with but slight and infrequent apprehensions of removal, had no doubt contributed to make time pass lightly over him. The original and more potent causes, however, lay in the rare perfection of his animal nature, to the moderate proportion of intellect, and the very trifling admixture of moral and spiritual ingredients. These latter qualities, indeed, being in barely enough measure to keep the old gentleman from walking on all fours, he possessed no power of thought, no depth of feeling, no troublesome sensibilities, nothing, in short, but a few commonplace instincts, which, aided by the cheerful temper that grew inevitably out of his physical well-being, did duty very respectably, and to general acceptance in lieu of a heart. He had been the husband of 3 wives, all long since dead, the father of 20 children, most of whom at every age of childhood or maturity, but likewise returned to dust. Here one would suppose might have been sorrow enough to imbue the sunniest disposition through and through with a sable tinge. Not so with our old inspector. One brief sigh sufficed to carry off the entire burden of these dismal reminiscences. The next moment he was ready for sport as any unbreeched infant, far readier than the collector's junior clerk, who at 19 years was much the elder and graver man of the two. Okay. I used to watch and study the patriarchal physical personage. While I think livelier curiosity than any other form of humanity they are presented to my notice, he was in truth a rare phenomenon, so perfect in one point of view, so shallow, so delusive, so impalpable, such an absolute nonentity in every other. My conclusion was that he had no soul, no heart, no mind, nothing, as I have already said, but instincts, and yet without so cunningly had the few materials of his character been put together that there was no painful perception of deficiency, but on my part an entire contentment with what I found in him. It might be difficult, and it was so, to conceive how he should exist hereafter, so earthly and sensuous did he seem, but surely his existence here, admitting that it was to terminate with his last breath, that had been not unkindly given, with no higher moral responsibilities than the beasts of the fields, but with larger scope of employment than theirs, and with all their blessed immunity from the dreariness and duskiness of age. One point in which he had vastly the advantage over the four-footed brethren, with his ability to recollect the good dinners which it had made no small portion of the happiness of his life to eat. His gourmandism was a highly agreeable trait, and to hear him talk of roast meat was as appetizing as a pickle or an oyster. As he possessed no higher attribute, and neither sacrificed nor vitiated any spiritual endowment by devoting all his energies and ingenuities to subserve the delight profit of his maw, it always pleased and satisfied me to hear him expatiate on fish, poultry, and butcher's meat, and the most eligible methods of preparing them for the table. His reminiscences of good cheer, however ancient the date of the actual banquet, seemed to bring the savor of pig or turkey under one's very nostrils. There were flavors in his palate that had lingered there not less than 60 or 70 years, and were still apparently as fresh as that of the mutton chop which he had just devoured for his breakfast. I have heard him smack his lips over dinners, every guest at which, except himself, had long been food for worms. It was marvelous to observe how the ghost of bygone meals were continually rising up before him, not in anger or retribution, but as if grateful for his former appreciation, and seeking to repudiate an endless series of employment at once shadowy and sensual. A tender loin of beef, a hind quarter of veal, a spare rib of pork, a particular chicken, or remarkably praiseworthy turkey, which had perhaps adorned his board in the days of the elder Adams. Would be remembered while all the subsequent experience of our race and all the events that brightened or darkened his individual career had gone over him with as little permanent effect as the passing breeze. The chief tragic event of the old man's life, so far as I could judge, was his mishap with a certain goose, which lived and died some 20 or 40 years ago, a goose of most promising figure, but which at table proved so inveterately tough that the carving knife would make no impression on its carcass, and it could only be divided with an axe and handsaw. But it is time to quit this sketch, on which, however, I should be glad to dwell at considerably more length, because of all men whom I have ever known, this individual was fittest to be a custom home officer. Most persons, owing to causes which I may observation enable me to sketch only in the merest outline. It is that of the collector, our gallant old general, who, after his brilliant military service, subsequently to which he had rolled over a wild western territory, had come hither 20 years before to spend the decline of his varied and honorable life. The brave soldier had already numbered 20, nearly or quite his three score years and 10, and was pursuing the remainder of his earthly march, burdened with infirmities which even the martial music of his own spirit stirring recollections could do little towards lightening. The step was palsied now that had been foremost in the charge. It was only with the assistance of a servant, and by leaning his hand heavily on the iron balustrade, that he could slowly and painfully second the custom-house steps, and, with the toilsome progress across the floor, attain his customary chair beside the fireplace. There he used to sit, gazing with a somewhat dim serenity of aspect at the figures that came and went amid the rustle of papers, the administering of oaths, the discussion of business, and the casual talk of the office, at which sounds and circumstances seemed but indistinctly to impress his sense, and hardly to make their way into his inner sphere of contemplation. His countenance in his repose was mild and kindly. If his notice was sought, an expression of courtesy and interest gleamed out upon his features, proving that there was light within him, and that it was only the outward medium of the intellectual lamp that obstructed the rays in their passage. The closer you penetrated to the substance of his mind, the sounder it appeared, when no longer called upon to speak or listen, either of which operations cost him an evident effort. His face would briefly subside into its former and not uncheerful quietude. It was not painful to behold this look, for though dim, it had not the imbecility of decaying age. The framework of his nature, originally strong and massive, was not yet crumbled into ruin. To observe and define the character, however, under such disadvantages, was as difficult a task as to trace out and build up anew in imagination an old fortress like Ticonderoga from a view of its grey and broken ruins. Here and there, perchance, the walls may remain almost complete, but elsewhere may be only a shapeless mound, cumbrous with its very strength, and overgrown through long years of peace and neglect, with grass and alien weeds. Nevertheless, looking at the old warrior with affection, for slight as was the communication between us, my feeling towards him, like that of all bipeds and quadrupeds who knew him, might not improperly be termed so. I could discern the main points of his portrait. It was marked with the noble and heroic qualities which showed it to be not by a mere accident, but of good right, that he had won what a distinguished name. His spirit could never, I conceive, have been characterized by an uneasy activity. It must at any period in his life have required an impulse to set him in motion, but once stirred up, with obstacles to overcome and an adequate object to be attained, it was not in the man to give out or fail. The heat that had formerly pervaded his nature, and which was not yet extinct, was never the kind that flashes and flickers in a blaze, but rather a deep red glow, as of iron in a furnace. Weight, solidity, firmness, this was the expression of his repose, even in such decay as had crept untimely over him. that were not dead, but only slumbering. He was yet capable of flinging off his infirmities like a sick man's gown, dropping the staff of age to seize a battle sword and starting up once more a warrior, and in so intense a moment the demeanor would have still been calm. Such an exhibition, however, was but to be pictured in fancy, not to be anticipated nor desired. What I saw in him as evidently as the indestructible ramparts of old Ticonderoga, already cited as the most appropriate simile, were the features of stubborn and ponderous endurance, which might well have amounted to obstinacy in his earlier days, of integrity that, like most of his other endowments, lay in a somewhat heavy mass, and was just as unmalleable or unmanageable as a ton of iron ore, and of benevolence which, fiercely as he led the bayonets out at Chippewa or Fort Erie, I take to be of quite as genuine a stamp as what actuates any or all the polemical philanthropists of the age. He had slain men with his own hand. For aught I know, certainly they had fallen like blades of grass at the sweep of the scythe, before the charge to which his spirit imparted its triumphant energy. But be that as it might, there was never in its heart so much cruelty as would have brushed the down off a butterfly's wing. I have not known the man to whose innate kindliness I would more confidently make an appeal. Many characteristics in those two which contribute not the least forcibly to impart resemblance. A sketch must have vanished or been obscured before I met the general. All merely graceful attributes are usually the most evanescent, nor does nature adorn the human ruin with blossoms of new beauty that have their roots and proper nutriment only to the chinks and crevices of decay, as she sows wallflowers over the ruined fortress of Ticonderoga. Still, even in respect of grace and beauty, there were points well worth noting. A ray of humor now and then would make its way through the veil of dim obstruction and glimmer pleasantly upon our faces. A trait of native elegance, seldom seen in the masculine character after childhood or early youth, was shown in the general's fondness for the sight and fragrance of flowers. An older soldier might be supposed to prize only the bloody laurel on his brow, but here was one who seemed to have a young girl's appreciation of the floral tribe. There beside the fireplace the brave old general used to sit, while the surveyor, though seldom when it could be avoided taking upon himself the difficult task of engaging him in conversation, was fond of standing at a distance and watching his quiet and almost slumberous countenance. He seemed away from us, although we saw him but a few yards off, remote though we passed close beside his chair, unattainable though we might have stretched forth our hands and touched his own. It might be that he lived a more real life within his thoughts than amid the inappropriate environment of the collector's office, the evolutions of the parade, the tumult of the battle, the flourish of old heroic music, headed 30 years before such scenes and sounds were all alive before his intellectual sense. Meanwhile, the merchants and shipmasters, the spruce clerks and uncouth sailors entered and departed. The bustle of this commercial and custom house life kept up its little murmur round about him, and neither with the men nor their affairs did the general appear to sustain the most distant relation. He was as much out of place as an old sword, now rusty, but which had flashed once in the battle's front, and showed still would have been among the link stand, would have been among the ink stands, paper folders, and mahogany rollers on the deputy collector's desk. There was one thing that much aided me in the renewing and recreating: the stalwart, the soldier of the Niagara frontier, the man of true and simple energy. It was the recollection of those memorable words of his, "I'll try, sir," spoken on the very verge of a desperate and heroic enterprise, and breathing the soul and spirit of New England hardihood, comprehending all perils and encountering all, if in our country valor were rewarded by heraldic honor. This phrase, which it seems so easy to speak, but which only he with such a task of danger and glory before him has ever spoken, would be the best and fittest of all mottos for the general shield of arms. It contributes greatly towards a man's moral and intellectual health to be brought into the habits of companionship with individuals unlike himself, who care little for his pursuits, and whose fear and abilities he must go out of himself to appreciate. The accidents of my life have often afforded me this advantage, but never with more fullness and variety than during my continuance in office. There was one man, especially the observations of whose character gave me a new idea of talent. His gifts were emphatically those of a man of business, prompt, acute, and clear-minded, with an eye that saw through all perplexities, and a faculty of arrangement that made them vanish as by the waving of an enchanter's wand, or, Harry Potter's wand. Bred up from boyhood in the custom house, it was his proper field of activity, and the many intricacies of business, so harassing to the interloper, presented themselves before him with the regularity of a perfectly comprehended system. In my contemplation he stood as the ideal of his class. He was indeed the custom house in himself, or at all events the mainspring that kept its imperiously revolving wheels in motion. For it's an institution like this, where its officers are appointed to subserve their own profit and convenience, and seldom with a leading reference to their fitness for the duty to be performed. They must perforce seek elsewhere the dexterity which is not in them. Thus, by an inevitable necessity, as a magnet attracts a steel filing, so did our man of business draw to himself the difficulties which everybody met with an easy condescension, and his kind forbearance towards our stupidity, which to his order of mind must have seemed little short of crime, would be forthwith, by the merest touch of his finger, make this incomprehensible as clear as daylight. The merchants valued him not less than we, his esoteric friends. His integrity was perfect. It was a law of nature with him rather than a choice or a principle. Nor can it be otherwise than the main condition of an intellect is so remarkably clear and accurate as is to be honest and regular in the administration of affairs. A stain on his conscience as to anything that came within the range of his vocation would trouble such a man very much in the same way, though to a far greater degree than an error in the balance of an account, or an ink blot on the fair page of a book of record. Here, in a word, and it is a rare instance in my life, I had met with a person thoroughly adapted to the situation which he held. Such were some of the people with whom I now found myself connected. I took it in good part at the hands of Providence that I was thrown into a position so little akin to my past habits, and set myself seriously to gather from it whatever profit was to be had. fellowship of toil and impracticable schemes with the dreamy brethren of Brook Farm, after living for 3 years within the subtle influence of an intellect like Emerson's. After those wild free days on the Azabeth, indulging fantastic speculations beside our fire of fallen boughs with Ellery Channing, after talking with Thoreau about pine trees and native relics in his hermitage at Malden, after growing fastidious by sympathy with the classic refinement of Hillard's culture, after becoming imbued with poetic sentiment at Longfellow's hearthstone, it was time at length that I should exercise other faculties of my nature and nourish myself with food, for which I had hitherto had little appetite. Even the old inspector was desirable as a change of diet to a man who had known. I looked upon it as an evidence in some measure of a system naturally well balanced and lacking no essential part of a thorough organization, that with such associations to remember I could mingle at once with men of altogether different qualities and never murmur at the change. Literature in its exertions and objects were now of little moment in my regard. I cared not at this period for books. They were apart from me. Nature excepted where human nature, the nature that is developed in earth and sky, was in one sense hidden from me, and all the imaginative delight wherewith it had been spiritualized, and all the imaginative delight wherewith it had been spiritualized passed away out of my mind. A gift, a faculty, if it had not departed, was suspended and inanimate within me. There would have been something sad, unutterably dreary in all this, but had I not been conscious that it lay at my own option to recall whatever was valuable in the past. It might be true indeed that this was a life which could not with impunity be lived too long. Else it might make me permanently other than I had been. Without transferring me to any shape which it would be worth my while to take, but I never considered it as other than a transitory life. There was always a prophetic instinct, a low whisper in my ear, that within no long period, and whenever a new change of custom should be essential to my good, change would come. Meanwhile, there I was, a surveyor of the revenue, and as so far as I have been able to understand, as good as a surveyor as need be, a man of thought, fancy, and sensibility, had he 10 times their surveyor's proportion of those qualities, may at any time be a man of affairs, if he will only choose to give himself the trouble. My fellow officers and the merchants and sea captains with whom my official duties brought me into any manner of connection viewed me in no other light, and probably knew me in no other character. None of them, I presume, had ever read a page of my inditing, would have cared a fig the more for me if they had read him at all. If they read them all. Nor would it have mended the matter in the least, had those same unprofitable pages been written with a pen like that of Burns or of Chaucer, each of whom was a custom-house officer in his day as well as I. It is a good lesson, though it may often be a hard one for a man who has dreamed of literary fame, and of making for himself a rank among the world's dignitaries by such means, to step aside out of the narrow circle in which his claims are recognized, and to find how utterly devoid of significance beyond that circle is all that he achieves and all he aims at. I know not that I especially needed the lesson either in the way of warning or rebuke, but at any rate I learned it thoroughly, nor it gives me pleasure to reflect that the truth, as to speak to me of books as matters with which I might possibly be conversant. This was my all of lettered intercourse, and it was quite sufficient for my necessities. No longer seeking nor caring that my name should be blazoned abroad on title pages, I smiled to think that it had now another kind of vogue. The custom house marker imprinted it with a stencil and black paint on proper bags and baskets of annatto and cigar boxes and bales of all kinds of dutiable merchandise, in testimony that these commodities had paid the impost and gone regularly through the office, borne on such queer vehicle of fame. A knowledge of my existence, so far as a name conveys it, it was carried where it had never been before, and I hope will never go again. But the past was not dead. Once in a great while, the thoughts that had seemed so vital and so active yet had been put to rest so quietly revived again. One of the most remarkable occasions when the habit of bygone days awoke in me was that which brings it within the law of literary propriety to offer the public the sketch which I am writing now. In the second story of the custom house there is a large room in which the brickwork and naked rafters had never been covered with paneling and plaster. The edifice originally protected on a scale adapted to the old commercial enterprise of the port, and with an idea of subsequent prosperity destined never to be realized, contains far more space than its occupants to know what to do with. This area hall, therefore, over the corridors apartments remains unfurnished to this day, and in spite of the aged cobwebs that festoon its dusky beams, appears still to await the labor of the carpenter and mason. Were a number of barrels piled upon one another containing bundles of official documents. Large quantities of similar rubbish lay lumbering the floor. It was sorrowful to think how many days and weeks and months and years of toil had been wasted on these musty papers, which were now only an encumbrance on earth and were hidden away in this forgotten corner, never more to be glanced at by human eyes. But then what reams of other manuscripts, filled not with the dullness of official formalities, but with the thought of inventive brains and the rich effusion of deep arts, had gone equally to oblivion, and that, moreover, without serving a purpose in their day, as these heaped up papers had, and, saddest of all, without purchasing for their writers the comfortable livelihood which the clerks of the custom house had gained by these worthless scratchings of the pen, yet not altogether worthless perhaps as materials of local history. Here no doubt statistics of the former commerce of Salem might be discovered, and memorials of our princely merchants, old King Derby, old Billy Gray, old Simon Forrester, and many other magnates. Prior to the revolution, there is a dearth of records, the earlier documents and archives of the custom house, having probably been carried off to Halifax. When all the king's officials accompanied the British Army in the flight from Boston, it has often been a matter of regret with me for going back perhaps to the days of the Protectorate. Those papers must have contained many references to forgotten or remembered men and to antique customs, which would have affected me with the same pleasure as when I used to pick up native arrowheads in the field under the old manse. But one idle and rainy day, it was my fortune to make a discovery of some little interest. Poking and burrowing into the heaped up rubbish in the corner, unfolding one and another document, and reading the names of vessels that had long ago foundered at sea or rotted at the wharves, and those of merchants never heard of, now unchanged nor very readily decipherable on their mossy tombstones. Glancing at such matters with the saddened, weary, half-reluctant interest which we bestow on the courts of dead activity, and exerting my fancy, sluggish with little use, to raise up from these dry bones an image of the old town's brighter aspect when India was a new region, and only Salem knew the way thither. I chanced to lay my hand on a small package carefully done up in a piece of ancient yellow parchment. This envelope had the air of an official record of some period long past, when clerks engrossed their stiff and formal chirography on more substantial materials than at present. There was something about it that quickened an instinctive curiosity and made me undo the faded red tape that tied up the package, with the sense that a treasure would here be brought to light. Unbending the rigid folds of the parchment cover, I found it to be a commission under the hand and seal of Governor Shirley in favor of one Jonathan Pugh as surveyor of His Majesty's customs for the port of Salem. In the province of Massachusetts Bay, I remember to have read, probably in Felt's Annals, a notice of the decease of Mr. Surveyor Pugh about 80 years ago, and likewise in a newspaper of recent times an account of the digging up of his remains in the little graveyard of St. Peter's Church. During the renewal of that edifice, nothing, if I rightly call to mind, was left of my respected predecessor, save an imperfect skeleton and some fragments of apparel and a wig of majestic frizzle, which, unlike the head that it once adorned, was in very satisfactory preservation. But on examining the papers with the parchment commission served to envelope, I found more traces of Mr. Pugh's mental part and the internal operations of his head than the frizzled wig had contained of the venerable skull itself. They were documents, in short, not official, but of a private nature, or at least written in his private capacity, and apparently with his own hand. I could account for their being included in the heap of custom house lumber only by the fact that Mr. Pugh's death had happened suddenly, and that these papers, which he probably kept in his official desk, had never come to the knowledge of his heirs, or were supposed to relate to the business of the revenue. On the transfer of the archives to Halifax, this package, proving to be of no public concern, was left behind, and had remained ever since unopened. The ancient surveyor, being little molested, I suppose, at that early day with business pertaining to his office, seems to have devoted some of his many leisure hours to researches as a local antiquarian and other inquisitions of a similar nature. These supplied material for petty activity to a mind that would otherwise have been eaten up with rust. A portion of his facts, by the by, did me good service in the preparation of the article entitled as equally valuable hereafter, or not impossibly may be worked up, so far as they go into a regular history of Salem, should my veneration for the natal soil ever impel me to so pious a task. Meanwhile they shall be at the command of any gentleman inclined and competent to take the unprofitable labor off my hands. As a final disposition, I contemplate depositing them with the Essex Historical Society, but the object that most drew my attention in the mysterious package was a certain affair of fine red cloth, much worn and faded. There were traces about it of gold embroidery, which, however, was greatly frayed and defeated, so that none or very little of the glitter was left. It had been wrought, as was easy to perceive, with wonderful skill of needlework, and the stitch, as I am assured by ladies conversant with such mysteries, gives evidence of a now forgotten art, not to be recovered even by the process of picking out the threads. The rag of scarlet cloth for time and wear, and a sacrilegious moth that reduced it to little other than a rag, on careful examination assumed the shape of a letter. It was the capital letter A. By an accurate measurement, each limb proved to be precisely 3 inches and a quarter in length. It had been intended, there could be no doubt, as an ornamental article of dress, but how it was to be worn, or what rank, honor, and dignity in by pastimes were signified by it, was a riddle which so evanescent are the fashions of the world in these particulars, I saw little hope of solving, and yet it strangely interested me. My eyes fastened themselves upon the old Scarlet Letter, and would not be turned aside. Certainly there was some deep meaning within it, most worthy of interpretation, and which, as it were, streamed forth. Subtly communicating itself to any sensibilities, but evading the analysis of my mind. While thus perplexed and cogitating among other hypotheses, cogitating means like thinking deeply about something or meditating on something, whether the letter might not have been one of those decorations which the white men used to contrive in order to take the eyes of natives. I happened to place it on my breast. It seemed to me, the reader may smile, but must not doubt any word. It seemed to me then that I experienced a sensation not altogether physical, yet almost so. As a burning heat, and as if the letter were not of red cloth, but red iron. I shuddered and involuntarily let it fall upon the floor. In absorbing contemplation of the Scarlet Letter, I had hitherto neglected to examine a small roll of dingy paper around which it had been twisted. This I now opened, and had the satisfaction to find recorded by the old surveyor's pen a reasonably complete explanation of the whole affair. There were several foolscap sheets containing many particulars respecting the life and conversation of one Hester Prynne, who appeared to have been rather a noteworthy personage in the view of our ancestors. She had flourished during the period between the early days of Massachusetts and the close of the 17th century. Aged persons alive in the time of Mr. Surveyor Pugh, and from whose oral testimony he had made up his narrative, remember her in their youth as a very old but not decrepit woman. Of a stately and solemn aspect, it had been her habit from an almost immemorial date to go about the country as a kind of voluntary nurse, and do whatever miscellaneous good she might, taking upon herself likewise to give advice in all matters, especially those of the heart, by which means, as a person of such propensities inevitably must, she gained from many people the reverence due to an angel, but I should imagine was looked upon by others as an intruder or a nuisance. Prying further into the manuscript, I found the record of other doings in carefully in mind that the main facts of that story are authorized and authenticated by the document of Mr. Surveyor Pugh. The original papers, together with the Scarlet Letter itself, a most curious relic, are still in my possession and shall be freely exhibited to whomsoever, induced by the great interest of the narrative, may desire a sight of them. I must not be understood as affirming that in the dressing up of the tale, and imagining the motives and modes of passion that influence the characters who figure in it, I have invariably confined myself within the limits of the old surveyor's half a dozen sheets of foolscap. On the contrary, I have allowed myself, as to such points, nearly or altogether as much license as if the facts had been entirely of my own invention. What I contend for is the authenticity of the outline. The incident recalled my mind in some degree to its old track. There seemed to be here the groundwork for a tale. It impressed me as if the ancient surveyor, in his garb of 100 years gone by, and wearing his immortal wig, which was buried with him but did not perish in the grave, had met me in the deserted chamber of the custom house. In his port was the dignity of one who had borne His Majesty's commission, and who had therefore illuminated by a ray of splendor that shone so dazzlingly about the throne. How unlike, alas, the hangdog look of a Republican official, who, as the servant of the people, feels himself less than the least, and below the lowest of his masters. With his own ghostly hand, the obscurely seen but majestic figure had imparted to me the scarlet symbol and the little of explanatory manuscript. With his own ghostly voice, he had exhorted me on the sacred consideration of my filial duty and reverence towards him, who might responsibly regard himself as my official ancestor, to bring his moldy and mothine lucubrations before the public. Do this, said the ghost of Mr. Surveyor. To bring his moldy and mothine lucubrations before the public, which is his papers, writings on papers. Do this, the ghost of Mr. Surveyor. Mr. Surveyor Pugh, emphatically nodding the head that looked so imposing within its memorable wig. Do this, and the profit shall be all your own. You will shortly need it, for it is not in your own days, as it was in mine, when a man's office was a life lease, and oftentimes an heirloom. But I charge you in this matter of his old mistress Bryn, give to your predecessor's memory the credit which will be rightfully due. And I said to the ghost of Mr. Surveyor Pugh, I will. So he is convinced that the ghost of Mr. Pugh is telling him to, take some actions and I guess write the story. On Mr. Brent's story, therefore, I bestowed much thought. It was the subject of my meditations for many an hour while pacing to and fro across my room, or traversing with a hundredfold repetition the long extent from the front door of the custom house to the side entrance and back again. Great were the weariness and annoyance of the old inspector and the weighers and gamecockers, whose slumbers were disturbed by the unmercifully lengthened tramp of my passing and returning footsteps. Remembering their own former habits, they used to say that the surveyor was walking the quarter-deck. They probably fancied that my sole object, and indeed the sole object for which a sane man could ever put himself into voluntary motion, was to get an appetite for dinner, and, to say the truth, an appetite sharpened by the east wind that generally blew along the passage was the only valuable result of so much indefatigable exercise. So little adapted is the atmosphere of a custom house for the delicate harvest of fancy and sensibility that I had remained there through 10 emergencies yet to come. I doubt whether the tale of the Scarlet Letter would ever have been brought before the public eye. My imagination was a tarnished mirror. It would not reflect, or only with miserable dimness, the figures with which I did my best to people it. The characters of the narrative would not be warmed and rendered malleable by any heat that I could kindle at any intellectual forge. They would take neither the glow of passion nor the tenderness of sentiment, but retained all the rigidity of dead corpses and sheared me in the face with a fixed and ghastly grin of contemptuous defiance. "What have you to do with us?" that expression seemed to say. "The little power you might once have possessed over the tribe of unrealities is gone. You have bartered it for a pittance of the public good. Go then and earn your wages." In short, the almost torpid creatures of my own fancy twitted me with imbecility and not without fair occasion. It was not merely during the 3 hours and a half which Uncle Sam claimed as his share of my daily life that this wretched numbness held possession of me. It went with me on my seashore walks and rambles into the country. Whenever, which was seldom and reluctantly, I bestirred myself to seek that invigorating charm of nature which used to give me such freshness and activity of thought the moment that I stepped across the threshold of the old man's. The same torpor as regarded the capacity for intellectual effort accompanied me home and weighed upon me in the chamber which I most absurdly termed my study. Nor did it quit me when, late at night, I sat in the deserted parlor, lighted only by the glimmering coal fire and the moon, striving to picture forth the imaginary scenes which the next day might flow out on the brightening page in many-hued description. If the imaginative faculty refused to act at such an hour, it might well be deemed a hopeless case. Moonlight in a familiar room, falling so white upon the carpet and showing all its figures so distinctly, making every object so minutely visible, yet so unlike a morning or noontide visibility, is a medium the most suitable for a romance writer to get acquainted with his elusive guests. There is the little domestic scenery of the well-known apartment, the chairs with each its separate individuality, the center table sustaining a work basket, a volume or two, and an extinguished lamp, the sofa, the bookcase, the picture on the wall, with all these details so completely seen, are so spiritualized by the unusual light that they seem to lose their actual substance and become things of intellect. Nothing is too small or too trifling to undergo this change and acquire dignity thereby. A child's shoe, the doll seated in her little wicker carriage, the hobby horse, whatever, in a word, has been used or played with during the day, is now invested with the quality of strangeness and remoteness, though still almost as vividly present as by daylight. Thus, therefore, the floor of our familiar room has become a neutral territory somewhere between the real world and fairyland, where the actual and the imaginary may meet, and each impute itself with the nature of the other. Ghosts might enter here without affrighting us. It would be too much in keeping with the scene to excite surprise. Were we to look about us and discover a form beloved but gone hence, now sitting quietly in a streak of this magic moonshine with an aspect that would make us doubt whether it had returned from afar, or had never once stirred from the fireside. The somewhat dim coal fire has an essential influence in producing the effect which I would describe. It throws its unobtrusive tinge throughout the room with a itself with the cold spirituality of the moonbeams and communicates, as it were, a heart and sensibilities of human tendencies to the forms which fancy summons up. It converts them from snow images into men and women. Glancing at the looking glass, we behold deep within its haunted verge the moldering glow of the half-extinguished anthracite, the white moonbeams on the floor, and a repetition of all the gleam and shadow of the picture, with one removed further from the actual, and nearer to the imaginative than at such an hour. With this scene before him, if a man sitting all alone cannot dream strange things and make them look like truth, he need never try to write romances. But for myself, during the whole of my custom house experience, moonlight and sunshine and the glow of firelight were just alike in my regard, and neither of them was one whit more available, more avail than the twinkle of a tallow candle, an entire glass of susceptibilities, and a gift connected with them of no great richness or value. But the best I had was gone from me. It is my belief, however, that had I attempted a different order of composition, my faculties would not have been found so pointless and inefficacious, which means not producing the desired effect. I might, for instance, have contented myself with writing out the narratives of a veteran shipmaster, one of the inspectors whom I should be most ungrateful, not to mention, since scarcely a day passed that he did not stir me to laughter and admiration by his marvelous gifts as a storyteller. Could I have preserved the picturesque force of his style and the humorous coloring which nature taught him how to throw over his description, the result, I honestly believe, would have been something new in literature, or I might readily have found a more serious task. It was a folly, with the materiality of this daily life pressing so intrusively upon me, to attempt to fling myself back into another age, or to insist on creating the semblance of a world out of airy matter, when at every moment the impalpable beauty of my soap bubble was broken by the rude contact of some actual circumstance. Wiser effort would have been to diffuse thought and imagination through the opaque substance of today, and thus to make it a bright transparency, to spiritualize the burden that began to weigh so heavily, to seek resolutely the true and indestructible value that lay hidden in the petty and wearisome incidents and ordinary characters with which I was now conversant. The fault was mine. The page of life that was spread out before me seemed dull and commonplace only because I had not fathomed the deeper impact. A better look than I shall ever write was there, leaf after leaf, presenting itself to me just as it was written out by the reality of the fitting hour, and vanishing as fast as it was written, only because my brain wanted the insight and my hand the cunning to transcribe it. At some future day, it may be, I shall remember a few scattered fragments and broken paragraphs, and write them down, and find the letters turned to gold upon the page. These perceptions have come too late. At the instant I was only conscious that what would have been a pleasure would now once was a hopeless toil. There was no occasion to make much moan about this state of affairs. I had ceased to be a writer of tolerably poor tales and essays, and had become a tolerably good surveyor of customs. That was all, but nevertheless, it is anything but agreeable to be haunted by a suspicion that one's intellect is dwindling away or exhaling without your consciousness, like either out of a vial, so that at every glance you find a smaller and less volatile residuum, which means a substance or thing that remains or is left behind, like a residue. Of the fact there could be no doubt, and examining myself and others, I was led to conclude conclusions in reference to the effect of public office on the character, not very favorable to the mode of life in question. Some other form, perhaps I may hereafter develop these effects. Suffice it here to say that a custom house officer of long continuance can hardly be a very praiseworthy or respectable personage for many reasons. One of them, the tenure by which he holds his situation, and another, the very nature of his business, which, though I trust an honest one, is of such a sort that he does not share in the united effort of mankind. An effect which I believe to be observable more or less in every individual who has occupied the position is that while he leans on the mighty arm of the Republic, his own proper strength departs from him. He loses in an extent proportioned to the weakness or force of his original nature. The capability of self-support, if he possess an unusual share of native energy or the enervating magic of the place, do not operate too long upon him, his forfeited powers may be redeemable. The ejected officer, fortunate in the unkindly above that sends him forth betimes to struggle with amid a struggling world, may return to himself and become all that he has ever been. But this seldom happens. He usually keeps his ground just long enough for his own ruin, and is then thrust out with sinews all unstrung. To totter along the difficult path of life as he best may, conscious of his own infirmity, that his tempered steel and elasticity are lost, he forever afterwards looks wistfully about him in quest of support external to himself. His pervading and continual hope, a hallucination which, in the face of all discouragement and making light of impossibilities, haunts him while he lives, and I fancy, like the compulsive throes of the cholera, torments him. Torments him for a brief space after death is that finally, and in no long time, by some happy coincidence of circumstances, he shall be restored to office. This faith, more than anything else, steals the pitch and availability out of whatever enterprise he may dream of undertaking. Why should he toil and moil and be at so much trouble to pick himself up out of the mud, when in a little while hence the strong arm of his uncle will raise and support him? Why should he work for his living here, or go on to dig gold in California, when he is so soon to be made happy at monthly intervals with a little pile of glittering coin out of his uncle's pocket? It is sadly curious to observe how slight a taste of office suffices to infect a poor fellow with this singular disease. Uncle Sam's cold, meaning no disrespect to the worthy old gentleman, has in his respect a quality of enchantment, like that of the devil's wages. Whoever touches it should look well to himself, or he may find the bargain. To go hard against him in its sturdy force, its courage and constancy, its truth, its self-reliance, self-reliance. And all that gives emphasis to manly character. He was a fine prospect in the distance. Not that the surveyor brought the lesson home to himself or admitted that he could be so utterly undone either by continuance in office or ejectment. Yet my reflections were not the most comfortable. I began to grow melancholy and restless, and continually prying into my mind to discover which of its poor properties were gone, and what degree of detriment had already accrued to the remainder. I endeavored to calculate how much longer I could stay in the custom house and yet go for the man. To confess the truth, it was my greatest apprehension, as it would never be a measure of policy to turn out so quiet an individual as myself. And it being hardly in the nature of a public officer to resign, it was my chief trouble, therefore, that I was likely to grow gray and decrepit in the surveyorship and become much such another animal as the old inspector. Might it not, in the tedious lapse of official life that lay before me, finally be with me as it was with this venerable friend, to make the dinner hour the nucleus of the day, and to spend the rest of it as an old dog spends it, asleep in the sunshine or in the shade. A dreary look forward this for a man who felt it to be the best definition of happiness to live throughout the whole range of his faculties and sensibilities. But all this while I was grieving myself very unnecessary alarm. Providence had meditated better things for me than I could possibly imagine for myself. A remarkable event of the third year of my surveyorship, to adopt the tone of P.P., was the election of General Taylor to the presidency. It is essential, in order to a complete estimate of the advantages of official life, to view the incumbent at the incoming of a hostile administration. His position is one of the most singularly irksome and in every contingency disagreeable that a wretched mortal can possibly occupy. I think they're like a tax collector is what they're trying to say. Is that job? Not sure though. With seldom an alternative of good on either hand, although what presents itself to him as the worst event may very probably be the best. But it is a strange experience, the man of pride and sensibility, to know that his interests are within the control of individuals who neither love nor understand him, and by whom, since one or the other must needs happen, he would rather be injured than obliged. Strange, too, for one who has kept his calmness throughout the contest, to observe the bloodthirstiness that is developed in the hour of triumph, and to be conscious that he is himself among its objects. There are few uglier traits of human nature than this tendency. Which I now witnessed in men no worse than their neighbors, to grow cruel, merely because they possess the power of inflicting harm. If the guillotine as applied to office holders were a literal fact instead of one of the most apt of metaphors, it is my sincere belief that the active members of the victorious party were sufficiently excited to have chopped off all our heads, and have thanked heaven for the opportunity. It appears to me, who have been a calm and curious observer, as well in victory as defeat, that this fierce and bitter spirit of malice and revenge has never distinguished the many triumphs of my own party as it now did that of the Whigs. The Democrats take the offices as a general rule because they need them, and because the practice of many years has made it the law of political warfare, which, unless a different system be proclaimed, it were weakness and cowardice to murmur at. But the long habit of victory has made them generous. They know how to spare when they see occasion, and when they strike, the axe may be sharp indeed, but its edge is seldom poisoned with ill will, nor is it their custom ignominiously to kick the head when they have just struck off. Nor is it their custom ignominiously disgrace or shame. Anyway, in short, the unpleasant as was my predicament, at best I saw much reason to congratulate myself that I was on the losing side rather than the triumphant one. If heretofore I had been none of the warmest of partisans, I began now at this season of peril and adversity to be pretty acutely sensible with which party my predictions lay. Nor was it without something like regret and shame that, according to a reasonable calculation of chances, I saw my own prospect of retaining office to be better than those of my Democratic brethren. But who can see an inch into futurity beyond his nose? My own head was the first that fell. The moment when a man's head drops off is as seldom or never, I am inclined to think, precisely the most agreeable of his life. Nevertheless, like the greater part of our misfortunes, even so serious a contingency brings its remedies and consolation with it. If the sufferer will but make the best rather than the worst of the accident which has befallen him, in my particular case the consolatory topics were close in hand, and indeed had suggested themselves to my meditations at considerable time. It was requisite to use them. In view of my precious weariness of office and vague thoughts of resignation, my fortune somewhat resembled that of a person who should entertain an idea of committing suicide, and although beyond his hopes might meet with the good hap to be murdered in the custom house as before in the old man's, I had spent 3 years, a term long enough to rest a weary brain, long enough to break off old intellectual habits and make room for new ones, long enough and too long to have lived in an unnatural state, doing what was really of no advantage nor delight to any human being, and without withholding myself from toil that would at least have stilled an unquiet impulse in me. Then, moreover, as regarded his unceremonious ejectment, the late surveyor was not altogether ill pleased to be recognized by the Whigs as an enemy, since his inactivity in political affairs, his tendency to roam at will in that broad and quiet field where all mankind may meet, rather than continue himself to those narrow paths where brethren of the same household must diverge from one another, had sometimes made it questionable with his brother Democrats whether he was a friend. Now, after he had won the crown of martyrdom, though with no longer a head to wear it on, the point might be looked upon as settled. Finally, little heroic as he was, it seemed more decorous to be overthrown in the downfall of the party with which he had been content to stand. To remain a forlorn survivor, who so many worthier men were falling, and at least after subsisting for 4 years on the mercy of a hostile administration, to be compelled then to define his position anew and calm the yet more humiliating mercy of a friendly one. Meanwhile, the press had taken up my affair and kept me for a week or two, careering through the public prints in my decapitated state like Irving's headless horseman, ghastly and grim, and longing to be buried as a political dead man ought. So much for my figurative self. The real human being all this time, with his head safely on his shoulders, had brought himself to the comfortable conclusion that everything was for the best. And making an investment in ink, paper, and steel pens, had opened his long disused writing desk, and was again a literary man. Now it was that the lucubrations or meditations of my ancient predecessor, Mr. Surveyor Pugh, came into play. Rusty through long idleness, some little space was requisite before my intellectual machinery could be brought to work upon the tale with an effect in any degree satisfactory. Even yet, though my thoughts were ultimately much absorbed in the task, it wears to my eye a stern and somber aspect, too much uncaddened by genial sunshine, too little received by the tender and familiar influences with which soften almost every scene of nature and real life, and undoubtedly should soften every picture of them. This uncaptivating still seething in turmoil in which the story shaped itself. It is no indication, however, that a lack of cheerfulness in the writer's mind, for he was happier while straying through the gloom of these sunless fantasies than at any time since he had quitted the old man's. Some of the briefer articles which contribute to make up the volume have likewise been written since my involuntary withdrawal from the toils and honors of public life, and the remainder are gleaned from annals and magazines of such antique date that they have gone round the circle and come back to novelty again. Keeping up the metaphor of the political guillotine, the whole may be considered as the posthumous papers of a decapitated surveyor, and the sketch which I am now bringing to a close, if too autobiographical for a modest person to publish in lifetime, will readily be excused in a gentleman who writes from beyond the grave. Peace be with all the world, my blessing on my friends, my forgiveness to my enemies, for I am in the realm of quiet. The life of the custom house lies like a dream behind me. The old inspector, who, by the by, I regret to say it, was overthrown and killed by a horse some time ago, else he would certainly have lived forever. He and all those other venerable personages who sat with him at the receipt of custom are but shadows in my view, white-headed and wrinkled images which my fancy used to sport with, has now flung aside forever. The merchants Pingree, Phillips, Shepherd, Upton, Kimball, Bertram, Hunt, these and many other names which had such a classic familiarity for my ears 6 months ago, these men of traffic who seem to occupy so important a position in the world, how little time has it required to disconnect me from them all, not merely in act, but recollection. It is with an effort that I recall the figures and appellations of these few. Some, likewise, my old native town will loom upon me through the haze of memory, a mist brooding over and around it, as if it were no portion of the real earth, but an overgrown village in cloudland with only imaginary inhabitants to people its wooden houses and walk, its homely lanes, and the unpicturesque prolixity of its main street. Henceforth it ceases to be a reality of my life. I am a citizen of somewhere else. My good townspeople will not much regret me, for though it has been as dear an object as any in my literary efforts to be of some importance in their eyes, and to win myself a pleasant memory in the abode and burial place of so many of my forefathers, there has never been for me the general atmosphere which a literary man requires in order to ripen the best harvest of his mind. I shall do better amongst the other faces, and these familiar ones, it need hardly be said, will do just as well without me. It may be, however, transporting and triumphant thought, that the great-grandchildren of the present race may sometimes think kindly of the scribbler of bygone days. Well, we do, yes, that is true. When the antiquary of days to come among the sights memorable in the town's history shall point out the locality of the town. Alright, so that was Introduction to the Scarlet Letter. That seems to be the perspective of the author in his background into writing the story. Looks like he was some kind of government official while trying to be, a writer at some point, but realized that he wasn't that good at writing and was better at being a government official, but then criticized that type of job and basically said, kind of hard to be a good person and be in politics your whole life, basically. And so then he started writing again. And now we have the Scarlet Letter. Awesome. So thank you for sitting with me through that, and I hope you enjoyed the ASMR. I hope you were able to get some ASMR wherever you are, and I will see you